on international hiring and understanding the costs of what that entails. My name's Andrew Lang. I'm a business manager here with Uniterra. Here also with me is Julian Christmas, our Chief Revenue Officer. At Uniterra, we do this stuff day in, day out. This is kind of what we specialize in, and helping our clients expand internationally, understanding those costs and helping them implement their plans so that they can focus on their business. This is going to be our last webinar of our 2020 program. We've done some on the basics of international expansion, Brexit, and a couple other subjects as well. But we're looking forward to coming back in 2021, bringing you a lot more good content. If you have any suggestions on webinar topics that you'd like to see related to international expansion, definitely send them to us in the chat or send me an email. My contact information will be at the end of the presentation. With that, we'll go ahead and get started. In this webinar, what we're going to go over, we'll go over some of the regional and country-specific costs at a really high level. Obviously, it's going to be tough to fit all countries into a half-hour presentation, but if there's any specific questions you have, we'll have a Q&A toward the end. We'd be happy to address those. We'll take a look at which countries is it more expensive to hire in, which countries are less expensive, what those costs look like for the employer and the employee. Costs don't often drive expansion, but they can certainly be a consideration. Usually companies decide to expand for looking for less expensive talent, or getting into a market for sales purposes, or maybe hiring a team of customer success folks. A lot of different reasons. It's rarely, just because it's less expensive to do business somewhere, we're going to go ahead and hire there, but definitely a consideration. We'll also go over ways to control costs using different methods of employment. If you've attended one of our previous webinars, that stuff is going to look pretty familiar, but it's a way of kind of budgeting for costs and then using different methods of employment to control that. We'll also have a Q&A, so if you have any questions, save them for then, or go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll answer them toward the end of the presentation. So some of the things that are really high level to look out for when you're looking to hire in a different country, obviously salaries. These can vary by country. The US is going to be on the higher end. Some European countries are on the lower end. Asia and South America are pretty variable. But this can definitely play a factor in where to hire if location is a concern, which is happening more and more frequently these days, with remote work being a more viable option for a lot of teams. Certainly COVID has made us realize that. Employer costs, so the total cost of employment. So beyond just the salary, this can include benefits, and that's statutory benefits, which are the standard in many countries, which is kind of unlike the US. With statutory benefits, the cost burdens place more on the employer. So that's things like healthcare, pension, and even where statutory benefits are the norm, supplementary benefits can help make a company more attractive for potential employees. So that's something that you might want to work with a benefits broker, or someone like Uniterra to scope those in whatever countries you're going into. There's also the costs of setup and support. So I talked about those different hiring methods. A little later in the presentation, we'll go over what the costs of those look like. Those are going to sit on top of the benefits costs and the salaries, but we'll have more information on those in a little bit. So to talk a little bit about the regional differences, or what that looks like in different regions around the world, I'll go ahead and pass this off to Julian.
Hello, everybody. Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So just wanting to run everybody through, it would make sense to sort of do a regional overview, looking at different parts of the world and what the landscape looks like in terms of how difficult, how costly it is to hire people, and the extent to which there's kind of flexibility around solutions. So just looking at some different aspects here in terms of ease of hiring. What we're talking about there is really the extent to which you have to jump through lots of hoops to hire and onboard sort of first employees. On a sliding scale, at one end where you have perhaps the US, where an offer letter is more or less all you need to have in order to get somebody on board, all the way through to some of the more complex areas of the world where you have to have very complex employment contracts. You have to consider collective bargaining agreements. Employment contracts have to be registered with the local social security and so on. So looking at how easy it is, how easy is that process? The cost of employment, we're looking at the actual financial cost of the business of employing a person on an ongoing basis. So not just their salary, but the wider cost of employment, taking into account social costs, statutory benefits, and other things. So how much does your employee cost your business? The complexity piece is looking at, and when we do a lot of solutioning with our clients, if they want to employ somebody in a new country, we work with them to understand and inform their decision making about which solution they want to implement. And the complexity piece is really looking at how complex and difficult is it to get the infrastructure in place in order to be able to hire and onboard employees in a new country. And the flexibility angle is really considering, are there multiple solutions available in a particular part of the world in order to employ people? Is it simply you have to do it through a legal entity, or are there other alternatives which give a little flexibility to an employer? So just running through the different regions, I think it's really helpful because sitting in Europe as I do, it's interesting to consider what does it look like, and how complex and expensive is it to hire over on the other side of the Atlantic there. I know that Andrew sits over there and wonders about many of the sort of corresponding hires that are made across in Europe and other parts of the world. So the US and Canada, in terms of ease of hiring, it is easy. Offer letters, employment contracts, generally straightforward, and there are few barriers to physically onboarding the employees. Cost of employment is low because social costs are low, although wider supplementary benefits can be quite expensive, so typically medical insurance. But the actual fundamental cost of employment, so salary plus mandatory social costs, they're low in the US and Canada. In terms of complexity, medium, I would say, just because in the US you do have to have a legal entity to hire, but actually it's not that complex to set one up. So medium at worst. And in terms of flexibility, relatively low flexibility, just because we're mainly talking about the US in terms of having to have a legal entity set up. That's not the case in Canada, but we do as much work in the US as we do in Canada. So North America, taking North America sort of in the round, relatively straightforward, but relatively rigid in terms of how we hire people. Central and South America, I think, is just typified by complexity, high cost, lack of flexibility. In most of the Latin American countries, a legal entity is required to hire locally. The employment landscape is very complex, and it's, to Andrew's point earlier, it's stacked heavily in favor of the employee, and the social costs of employment are high. Not just the social costs, and there's some more information about that later, but the wider benefits landscape in Latin America also leads to a lot of extra costs to the employer. So Europe is a bit more variable. Hiring is somewhere between kind of medium and complex, depending on which countries. UK is quite straightforward, but some of the countries that border the Mediterranean, so Italy and Spain, for example, are more complex in terms of the absolute requirement to follow the letter of employment law, which is complex and again stacked in favor of the employee rather than the employer. Cost of employment is variable. Social costs are actually quite high, but additional costs are relatively minimal because social costs capture a lot of the, for example, pension savings that are employees and employers are required to contribute towards unemployment insurances and so on, are often covered by social costs. So the social costs are relatively high, but the costs beyond there tend to be relatively minimal. In terms of complexity and flexibility, the good thing about the European hiring landscape is it is possible. This is a common theme in our webinars. It is possible to hire in almost every European country without having a legal entity in place, and that's what makes Europe a relatively attractive place to hire. One or two people here or there, either on an opportunistic or strategic basis. Hiring one or two people can be relatively straightforward and relatively inexpensive, just because there isn't a need to have a legal entity in place. Middle East is a quirky part of the world because hiring is straightforward and the cost of employment is relatively low. Taxes and social security, broadly speaking, non-existent in the Middle East, but the complexity level and the is high and flexibility low, because the requirement to have either a legal entity or a branch, something fairly complex in place, and it is a difficult process to get these in place in the Middle East. There's no flexibility around it, so the Middle East is an interesting sort of conundrum when it comes to hiring. And the Far East is relative. So Far East, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and I suppose including Australia too. Ease of hiring is relatively variable, but actually not as complex as, say, Central South America. The cost of employment, I would say, is medium. Social costs, I was looking at a table earlier on, and social costs are broadly in line with kind of global averages. Complexity is relatively high in the Far East because, again, there's quite often the need for a legal entity. There are lesser registrations that are an option, but generally only for very specific activities, pre-commercial activity. So very early stage investigation of markets, and frankly, not many of our clients fall into that category. They usually give rise for the need for a legal entity. And again, flexibility is low simply because of that. More often than not, the requirement to have a legal entity or at the very least a branch in place. So hopefully that gives a kind of an interesting overview, covering most parts of the world anyway. If anybody has any interest in specific countries, please drop a note into the chat. I'll be happy to make some comments about specific countries, but that kind of typifies the landscape across the world. Andrew, do you want to go to the next one? So one of the things we said we cover is cost of employing in terms of salaries, and can't really go into a country by country comparison of actual salaries. We do quite a lot of work with clients in terms of benchmarking salaries in specific countries for specific roles. So, it's not a straightforward thing to do, to take a specific role and benchmark what salary and particularly benefit expectations would be in filling that role in a particular country. But we do that as part of our HR consulting work. And of course, we're still seeing we're still seeing hiring patterns which take account of not just skills but also earnings. So the cost of employment, which varies across the world, which means that a lot of our clients are so a lot of our clients are based in the US, HQ'd in the US, and hiring in Europe, hiring in other parts of the world, sometimes on an opportunistic basis, but there's still a link with certain types of skill and certain types of activity and an attractive cost base in other parts of the world. So we certainly still see sales and marketing activity in Europe, engineering functions and R&D functions in Eastern Europe, countries like the Ukraine, Poland are popular locations for R&D and sort of low-cost technical skills. There are some countries in the Far East, such as the Philippines and Indonesia, where we still see that they're favourable in terms of setting up, for example, customer support facilities, but increasingly also engineering in that part of the world. So when I say engineering, kind of software and technology engineering. Excuse me. And in Asia and South America, there is quite a lot of variability because there are some very big metropolitan areas where cost of living is high, skills are high, skill levels are high, and of course salaries are high as well. But there are plenty of locations where salary expectations are low. But yeah, we see a lot of opportunistic hiring now all around the world. Still a propensity for more sort of strategic building of sales and marketing activities in specific countries to address specific markets. But there is a lot of variation. And if anybody who's on the webinar is interested to understand specific cost levels in either specific countries or regions, and get in touch after the webinar, we'll be happy to talk further about that, potentially engage in some benchmarking exercises. Beyond the salaries themselves, and this really is a conversation that we have to have, almost on a daily basis with clients and prospects, which is to think beyond the actual cost of the salary cost. Look beyond the salary and consider the total cost of employment where you're looking to hire, because it's so variable across the world. So again, a lot of our clients are based in the US. Social costs in the US are relatively low, so the total cost of salaries plus social costs, they're aligned quite closely, and it's difficult to conceive of different parts of the world where social costs and on costs of employment can run to very easily 20, 30, 40%, but in some extreme cases, and we'll take a quick look at a case study in a moment, but in extreme cases 50, 60% and beyond. In Europe, social costs are actually relatively high. I think I mentioned that before. So by social costs, I mean really statutory costs which are incurred by the employer over and above the cost of the salary, which are required by law. So social costs often capture sort of national medical support, retirement benefits, unemployment insurance, and various other components. You only have to look at a French payslip to understand quite how complex the social systems can be in some countries. So social costs are relatively high in Europe, and they average, I think, about 23%, which is quite a lot higher than the global average, which is closer to 15%. But non-statutory benefits, beyond social costs, there aren't really many benefits which are required from a statutory point of view. Where things get more complicated, a region like I don't like to be quite so general as to refer to South America as a complex area, but social costs and costs of employment are very high in South America. Andrew, if we go to the next slide, I think it's probably worth just looking at this case study that we have for Brazil. So what I've found in fact in preparing for this webinar is that it's quite difficult to establish through simple, like we all like to do a bit of internet research, what is the total cost of employment in a particular country. I've taken Brazil as an example because of all the countries in the world, it's the one that I know has an extremely high cost of employment, total cost of employment. And looking around, I got as far as establishing from KPMG website that social security costs for the employer are 29%, relatively high, but not extraordinary compared to a lot of the costs we see in Europe and other places around the world. So it doesn't appear on the face of it that the cost of hiring in Brazil would be stratospheric, but it is in fact stratospheric. So there are so many aspects that you have to add on top of that, layering on, for example, the 13-month salary. There's some vacation loading, so when employees take vacation, you have to pay them extra. All employees are entitled to meal vouchers, to pay for their lunch, for travel vouchers to get to work and back. There are various other aspects, and of course, there's a layering effect because the social costs can layer on top of these extra elements. And what we end up with in Brazil, estimates vary from, and it does vary according to salary, but between 75 and 85% is typically quoted as the total cost, the employment cost in Brazil. So your employee, you're planning to take on somebody in Brazil, you want to pay them $100,000. It's important to understand that the real cost to your business is going to be in the region of 180,000. And a further consideration is, if you're planning to hire one person in Brazil, I would always recommend that, because it's such a very complex place to set up a legal entity in order to hire, my recommendation would always be to go with a PEO or an employer of record provider if it's just to be the one employee. Bear in mind that their fees, which are generally calculated as a percentage of the earning, don't just apply to the salary, but they also apply to the on costs. So if you're engaging for a employer of record service, they may charge, let's for argument's sake, say 20% of salary. In this example, where the employee has $100,000 salary, it wouldn't actually be 20% of $100,000. It would actually be 20% of $180,000. So it's important to consider that is typically the way, that's the way things work in the employer of record, the PEO world. So hopefully that was helpful to understand, just an interesting case study in how expensive it can be. Andrew, I think are you taking this slide, or am I taking this one?
Indeed. Yeah. So, on the back of what Julian said, and on top of those kind of social costs and taxes, there's other costs like meeting compliance obligations. This can include things like VAT filings or annual statutory audits, local legal, or, like in the case of Spain, fiscal representation. So this stuff can kind of add on top of what it costs to do business in a country. Some countries are really difficult with compliance and require a lot. Obviously it varies by country. Some countries don't have as many requirements, so you're not budgeting as much of a cost. A lot of companies are kind of taken aback at the idea of establishing a local legal entity when they're looking at doing business somewhere else. It can seem like an administrative burden for them, a large cost burden, but really working with a partner, or someone who knows what they're doing, can help mitigate that. And then this last bullet point here, there are a lot of different ways to hire people in different countries. I know Julian went over some of them in that table a few slides ago, talking about the flexibility of employment options. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. There's some employment options, which I'll go over on this slide here, are largely dependent on what the headcount of your team is going to be in the country, what the kind of role the team is performing, whether there are senior people on the team, and then if there's a fixed place of business too. If you've attended any of our previous webinars, you're probably familiar with those as the criteria for permanent establishment risk. But I'll go over some of these, the kind of four main mechanisms that we see for hiring in different countries, and how those interface with that PE risk and what the use cases are. So hiring independent contractors, a lot of folks do this when they're looking at kind of dipping their toes into the pool in another country. So it's very fast to do. There's no additional administrative costs. So you're not paying payroll taxes, social costs, things like that are placed on the contractor to remit to the government. This isn't available everywhere. It is a legal mechanism in some countries. The US and India come to mind. But important to note that in a lot of countries, it's actually, depending on the work that the person is doing, it's necessary to bring them on as an employee. Typical use case scenario for something like this would be hiring people to work on a specific project, so like software development, or hiring on a temporary basis. This can be used, when other options are too expensive, but be very careful for triggering that permanent establishment risk. You can open yourself up to a lot of liability. Another way, and Julian mentioned, is this international PEO EOR to bring employees on through there. And essentially, that's another company that's going to hire your employee and then lease them back to you for a monthly fee. Typically, it's a percentage of what the employee makes. So it can be anywhere from 15 to 20%. I think is pretty typical to hire someone through an EOR. This is a compliant with HR law, but again, depends on what the employees are doing. So if you have salespeople who are generating revenue, senior folks who are director or VP level, that's a trigger to the government that maybe there's actually significant commercial activity happening in country, and they'll need to kind of collect their piece of the pie on that. This can be used, like Julian said, somewhere like Brazil or China or Japan, where it's difficult to set up an entity, it takes a long time, but if you need to hire someone fast, you want to be careful with the headcount here too. Once you get over maybe 4 or 5 employees, that's going to be another trigger to the government that, again, there's significant commercial activity and they're going to want to collect taxes on that. So typical use case for this would be, while you're getting an entity set up, or if you've got a small team of software engineers, support staff, that kind of stuff, not generating revenue directly, this could be a good option. In the bottom left there's hiring without a legal entity. So this is what we call a payroll registration, and it's typically a European solution. There's a couple other countries that allow it. And I think Canada, Australia, are a couple of those. But this is similar to an international PEO EOR. It's compliant with HR law, but you want to make sure employees aren't generating revenue, that they're not senior level staff. But this allows you to have a direct employment relationship with the employee. So instead of another company hiring them and leasing them out to you, sometimes in Europe, that can make employees feel like a company isn't really dedicated to them or dedicated to that market. So their paychecks coming from another company than the one they're doing work for. So this allows you to register your domestic entity, so your US or wherever your domestic HQ is, to provide payroll in that country. So that would be directly hiring these employees. They've got an employment contract that comes from you, a paycheck that comes from you. It's a lot less administrative burden, a lot less cost than making a legal entity. So again, just be careful for that PE risk, permanent establishment risk. But this can be a good way of kind of testing out a market where it's available. And then the last one is hiring with a legal entity. Obviously, this one is fully compliant, both HR and corporate law. You can have an unlimited number of employees in commercial activities. So sales staff are okay, senior level staff are okay. There's going to be a higher administrative burden and higher costs up front. But I think as Julian's going to go over on the next slide, there's some savings to be had with if you're going to be in that market for a long time, and if you're going to be dedicated to that market, it's a more cost-effective way to go than something like a PEO.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm conscious of time, but this is a really key slide for anybody who's thinking about what the underlying costs are, literally in sort of pounds and dollar senses. And apologies, everything here is stated in dollars. But this is really looking at the different solutions that Andrew just presented to us and considering what are the costs to the business of implementing and supporting each particular solution. So we got the different options along the top. So independent contractor, PEO, so going with that sort of third-party employer option. The non-resident employer is the typically European option where you can employ in a country but without having to set up a legal entity there. And then the last one is the legal entity option. Just in terms of the different types of costs, so initial setup, well, the independent contractor is a very simple column to discuss because really there's no cost to the employee beyond what you're paying the contractor as a day rate or an hourly rate or a weekly rate. There's no cost beyond that. in terms of PEOs, so it's the employer of record model. Setup costs are low, so it doesn't really generally cost much to get somebody onto an employer of record offering. However, it is a super convenient solution, I have to say, in certain situations, and we do recommend it relatively frequently for some of the more complex markets, like Brazil, as we talked about, maybe China. But that comes at a cost, so the monthly cost can be quite high, and typically is stated as a percentage of the total package that the employee is earning and being paid, and it's subject to a de minimis as well. So it will be a variable cost, which is a percentage of earnings, subject to a de minimis, which is quite often perhaps around somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000. But for our typical client base, higher salaries mean that the monthly cost per person could be quite easily between $2,000 and $3,000. No annual compliance really attached to this this model, and in terms of year one costs, just to help with sort of clarifying what the total cost associated with each of these different models is. I just looked at what the year one cost would be under each solution if you're hiring one employee, and the year one cost if you're perhaps building a small team, so 3 employees. So on a PEO, your year one cost based on $1,000 of setup and $2,000 to $3,000 a month. Your year one cost, which would be the same as your year two cost, would be between $25,000 and $37,000. This is, and multiplied by 3 if you have 3 employees. Our non-resident employer solution, and it's interesting, so many times we talk to new prospects and companies that we're wanting to work with, and they're not even aware that you're able to hire in a lot of countries without having a legal entity there. So it can quite often be a good icebreaker to explain to our prospective clients that they don't need a legal entity when they thought they did. Setup costs relatively low because it's a relatively straightforward thing to do, so $1,000 to $3,000. Monthly cost is in the sort of low to mid hundreds per month in terms of running a monthly payroll. Annual compliance costs can be somewhere between $0 and $500 typically. So your year one cost for one employee would be $4,000 to $9,000. Year one cost for 3 employees is barely more than that, so it would be $6,000 to $13,000. So there's clear efficiency there that you get that you don't achieve with the employer of record model. The subsidiary and the legal entity option, and in some situations we'd recommend registering a branch instead of incorporating a subsidiary, but from a cost perspective they're more or less the same. So the initial setup is high, monthly costs are high because a legal entity requires not just the payroll cost but also there's a requirement for accounting. Quite often there's a localized accounting requirement which does need to be done locally. Our offering takes care of all of that and folds all the local requirements in, and there's also ongoing compliance, VAT compliance, GST compliance, and so on. Annual compliance, relatively expensive, so that's financial statements, corporate tax returns, $5,000 to $10,000. So when we come to the year one cost, $19,000 to $44,000 for one employee, that's quite a weighty cost, and a little bit more than what you would incur under the employer of record model. But if we look at 3 employees, it's still expensive, but it's not much more expensive than that year one employee cost. So I think it's fair to say that if you're looking at one employee and it's a complex country and you're weighing up between PEO and setting up a subsidiary, I think I would always recommend PEO because it's immediate. You can switch it on, you can switch it off, and you don't get left with a legacy of a legal entity in a country where you didn't intend to have one. If you're looking at building a small team, 3 or more, then in every location, I would always recommend going down that path, going the extra mile, setting up a legal entity and employing them directly and really owning the employment relationship. that's a quick run through that slide. We circulate the slides after the webinar, so we will. So if anybody's interested to sort of get a better grasp of those numbers, they'll be available afterwards. And again, happy if anybody's interested to reach out. We can have a sort of country-specific discussion because, of course, these are fairly generic numbers that we're providing here, but hopefully helpful. Andrew, we've got a couple more slides, but I'm conscious of time. Why don't you do sort of 20 seconds on this one, and I'll do 20 seconds on the next one, and then we'll deal with any questions.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds good. This slide's basically just to show you, a quick overview of what some of the employment costs are as a percentage of salary and total. This is not counting some of the supplementary benefit costs. Obviously, the USA is on the lower end, but this kind of bears out what we've been talking about. Brazil is quite high, and then some of the European countries, Italy, France, Austria, are pretty expensive as well. But yeah, just to give you a quick overview of what you could expect to budget in some of these markets. And again, like Julian said, we'll circulate these slides so you've got them afterwards.
Yeah, and finally, so the final one, and again, just 30 seconds on this. I certainly couldn't claim to have a full understanding of global hiring trends, but this is really a comment on what we're seeing with our clients. International expansion, going back, say, 10 years ago, there was a big focus on sales, marketing, and building offices. What with particularly in the last 12 months, COVID and technology have certainly played their part, but there is a propensity for all business roles to be positioned and say anywhere in the world, but there's a lot more flexibility now around where certain roles can sit. Cost is a factor, but the fact that remote working the remote working landscape has changed so much in the last 12 months. Certainly kept us busy. We did have a little bit of a lull over the summer and spring and summer when lockdown was in full flight. But certainly, we're very busy now with new work with new clients, a lot of opportunistic hiring going on, and hire wherever the talent's available. But one thing we should, final word is that, in terms of geographic focus, actually, the work we do now is very similar to the work we did 1 and 2 years ago in terms of geographic focus. And what we're not seeing is a massive shift into new and exotic markets. I would say our top 20 countries are probably broadly similar to what the list would have looked like a couple of years ago. Andrew, I think that's it. Shall we? I think almost everyone stayed on, which is very kind. Thank you, everyone, for giving us a little bit of your extra time. If we've got any questions, Andrew, do you want to just shout them out, and I'll between us, we can do our best to answer them.
Yeah. I think there's been a couple that came in. First one is, how much international hiring is going on right now? And I guess that's what we see, with our client base.
Yeah. So I think I probably addressed that just with some of my comments just a minute ago. But actually, as of now, the amount of hiring that we're seeing is, things are going very well. There's a lot of hiring going on. It's difficult to unpick. So we've undertaken some, interesting new marketing initiatives. So we are seeing more opportunity than we were before anyway. But our clients, our existing client base, who were relatively static over the sort of what I would call the COVID months, they're back on the move. We're seeing international hiring moving forward again, and so our existing client base are back into expansion mode, and we're seeing a lot of new business coming in. But again, some of it's opportunistic hiring, one person here, one person there, and in some situations it's a more strategic approach to expanding into multiple countries in a fairly short space of time.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, we had a lot of exploratory calls earlier in the kind of spring and early summer. A lot of people trying to do fact finding and not necessarily willing to pull the trigger, but we've seen a lot more companies that are starting to expand out nowadays. Next question. Do you know where it's easy to hire IT engineers? Mexico or Brazil, or I suppose anywhere else too?
Yeah, so I'm just looking at that question. Actually, I've just seen it. So what I wonder is whether that's a question about where it's easy to find IT engineers, as a if you're looking for a team of IT engineers, where is it easy to find and hire them, or from a practical point of view, how easy is hiring in Mexico and Brazil? From a practical point of view, in terms of the need for a legal entity and relative complexity of the HR landscape, certainly Mexico is easier than Brazil, I would suggest, from both points of view. There is one trend we have seen actually is that there is more of a move to hire engineers and technical IT teams in South America. The advantage being, of course, from a time zone perspective, it's the same or similar to the US, which is very helpful. So yes, there has been a trend in that direction, but I'd love to understand if it's a question about how available are IT engineers in Mexico and Brazil. I think I couldn't answer that immediately, but in terms of ease of hiring and ease of payrolling, they're both relatively complex, but Mexico is certainly more straightforward than Brazil.
Great. And then I think we've got time for one more. Do you see a lot of expansion into Africa in the work that you do? That we do, I guess, at Uniterra. I would say, we have a pretty large tech client base, and they don't have much of a footprint in Africa. But we do have some one-offs of companies that are doing work there that need, they're doing either, infrastructure development or kind of tapping into that market. I haven't seen, and Julian, let me know your perspective on this, but I haven't seen a lot of expansion for talent reasons, for looking at hiring development teams or customer service, but we have seen one-offs here and there.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think where we have seen expansion into Africa is usually around, so oil and gas is obviously one area that for which Africa is very interesting. We've seen quite a lot of interest from agri-tech, although agri-tech isn't a big part of our sort of client base. And then again, to your point about infrastructure, Andrew, there's with telecoms, for example. I know that you were dealing with quite a large opportunity from a telecoms company who was needing to hire engineers in a number of African countries. But these are definitely the exceptions rather than the norm. We do support African expansion, but it's less common in our client base than expansion to the more common markets of Europe and I guess the Far East.
Great. Well, I think with that, I know we've pushed 15 minutes our time, but I appreciate everyone coming on, like most people have. If you have any questions, my information is up on the screen there. We've also got a general inquiry line if I'm offline during the evenings here in California. But feel free to reach out, if you've got specific questions on any countries, any hiring mechanisms, costs of doing business in another country. Those are all questions that we're happy to field. So if there's anything we can do to help, we'd love to get in touch with you. Thanks, everyone, for joining our webinar. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you for more in 2021.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.